Hey friends, this is Boxy Brown. I am a Knight of the Round Table with Dark Age Camelot, and I am here today to do a little Assassin Basics video. I'm going to be covering the basics of the three Assassins in Dark Age Camelot, briefly explaining some of the differences, talking about the spec lines they have access to, just little things like that. We're going to be releasing a series of these videos. Couple ones later on detailing advanced techniques and mechanics, some talking about little tips and tricks, ways to ensure maximum success. So be sure to keep an eye out for those. And all right, let's dive right in. So, what are assassins? Assassins are basically melee damage dealers with light defense. They only have leather armor and evade, no speckable parry or shield or anything like that. That attack from stealth with devastating opening moves, and then follow up with precision strikes and use poisons to sort of incapacitate or weaken or further damage their enemies. So what are the differences between the three assassins? The three assassins are Infiltrator on Albion, Nightshade on Hibernia, and Shadowblade on Midgard. And since Dark Age does not mirror classes, there's only one class in the game that's the same across all three realms. Each one is unique. Each one has its own advantages and disadvantages, its own strengths and weaknesses. Uh, for example, the Infiltrator has access to the most specialization points per level in the game. That allows them to take advantage of a wider variety of specs and spec for things that the other two assassins don't have access to until much higher realm ranks. The Nightshade has access to a line of powerful magic spells, which allows them to deal moderate to high damage at range and interrupt enemy spellcasters or archers or anybody that needs to cast a spell. So very useful tools right there. The Shadowblade on Midgard has access to two-handed weapons, which means that their stealth openers can hit for more damage, and they also have access to the left axe offhand weapon spec line, which has its own advantages, which we will detail in a later video when we talk about the actual class mechanics of assassins and sort of why each one has the advantages and disadvantages it has. Okay, so now that we've introduced the three assassins, we're going to talk about the different spec lines they can invest their points into. But before we sort of dive into that, we need to talk about composite spec because it's fairly important for specking your assassin. Now, composite spec is the idea that you don't actually have to train, for assassins anyway, stealth and venom up to level 50 in order to get the level 50 bonus from them. Instead, what you can do is rely on the skill bonus that you get from both your items and your realm rank to sort of make up the difference between your base, like the number of levels you actually train the skill, and level 50. So, for example, if you want to use the level 50 poison and you have a bonus of 11 from your items and your realm rank to the Envenom line, you only need to train Envenom to level 39 because 39 plus 11 equals 50. Then you can take all the points that you would have invested, just to get 50 in Venom, and you can spend them elsewhere, right? You can raise your critical strike line, you can raise your dual wield line, you can raise your main hand spec line. It doesn't matter. You can spend those points elsewhere. So that's the idea of composite spec. So now that we've talked about composite spec, let's go ahead and talk about the individual skill lines that assassins have access to. Now, the first one I want to talk about is stealth, because stealth is very important to assassin play. Virtually no assassins choose not to train stealth. Pretty much everybody's running with it. And basically what stealth is invisibility, right? Activating stealth renders the user undetectable to enemy players in exchange for a reduction in movement speed. Quick note about stealth is that taking or dealing any damage or the use of any items or abilities will cause stealth to break, rendering you, visible again. And yeah, I think that's about it. It's about as deep as I want to go into the mechanics of stealth. We're going to be doing a later video where we get super specific with how stealth works in relation to you and your enemies and all that stuff. So if you're curious about that, just keep an eye out for that video. But the reason stealth is so important to assassins is because, first of all, it lets you evade, escape and evade fights that you don't want to fight. And it lets you choose your targets, which is infinitely helpful. I mean, that is one of the things that makes assassins super, super powerful, is just the fact that they start almost every fight on their own terms. There are times where you get caught out of stealth. There are times when you get randomly popped from stealth, and there are times when stealthers that have trained more into their stealth line and their stealth augmenting realm abilities will pop you. I mean, that does happen, but 90% of the time the fights are on your terms, and that's huge. So stealth, very important. So the next skill line I want to talk about is in Venom, and the things that I have to say about in Venom are super short. It's the most powerful spec line we have access to, in my opinion. I think most assassin players feel the same way. I can't think of any assassins that don't take it all the way to composite level 50. Oh, like I said before, in Venom is one of the spec lines that benefits directly from composite spec, so keep that in mind. Um, yeah, you should be using every poison in every fight. It lets you severely cripple your enemies, lets you deal additional damage with damage over time poisons. There's no reason not to apply every single poison to your target every single fight. So train it to 50, composite 50, and use every poison. Boom, done. So the next spec line I want to talk about is Critical Strike. And Critical Strike is unique because it is the spec line that contains all of the alpha strikes. And an alpha strike is your stealth opener attacks. So while Critical Strike can be thought of as just a regular melee spec line like your main hand or offhand weapon spec, really it's a lot more unique than that. Because you're talking about having access to melee styles that only assassins get, some of which are very powerful. So a lot of assassins, I would say most assassins, choose to run with Critical Strike, but there's also a fairly large portion of the assassin community that says, no, I don't need to put any points into Critical Strike at all. I'd rather invest more points into my main hand weapon and my offhand weapon in order to sort of do more consistent damage with those melee styles. So that's Critical Strike, sort of a divisive thing. You sort of need, this is all personal preference stuff. You need to decide what kind of assassin you want to be, and spec accordingly, and Critical Strike is sort of what makes or breaks that choice. Alright, the next spec line that I want to talk about for assassins is your main hand weapon spec. Now, main hand weapon spec, I know I didn't talk about it before, is another one of those spec lines that is affected by composite spec. And the reason I didn't want to talk about it before is because when it comes to your main hand weapon, it's a little more complicated than when you're dealing with stealth or in Venom in terms of composite spec. Now, I'm not going to get into the game mechanics of why that is, right? That's going to be for a later video. What you need to know is that most assassins choose to achieve a 51 composite spec with their main hand weapon. And they do this for the purposes of defense penetration and main hand weapon damage. Very few assassins actually use the melee styles available in the main hand weapon spec. They just invest enough points to get that main hand weapon to 51 composite. Now there's a couple of exceptions to this, obviously. It's a complicated issue, but if you're not going to use the main hand weapon styles, there is no reason to invest more points than necessary. So main hand weapon spec, that's what I have to say about that in terms of composite spec. Now the other thing that's important with main hand weapon spec is your type of weapon. So in Dark Age there are three types of melee damage. There's crush, there's slash, and there's thrust. And for assassins, you will generally have access to two out of three of these. So you'll have access to slash and thrust. Shadow Blades are the exception. They only have access to slash because Midgard does not get thrust weapons. But Shadow Blades also have an ability called Bludgeon that lets them change their damage type from slash to crush for a set duration. So you come up against an enemy that's weak to crush damage, you hit that ability, boom, you're dealing more damage. Kind of simple, kind of straightforward. But for the other two assassins, you need to pick between either thrust damage or slash damage, and that's really why main hand weapon is important. It's for the defense penetration, like I was saying earlier, the weapon damage, and the damage type. So I mean that's about it. Keep it at 51 composite unless you've got a style that you really like using in sort of the upper levels of main hand weapon spec. Okay, last but certainly not least is your offhand weapon spec. And the reason I saved it for last is because it is a tricky beast. It's a complicated thing to try to cover. I'm going to try to keep it as simple as possible, but honestly, dual wield mechanics, I could do an entire video just on that, and it would be 30 minutes long. So the basics, right? What you need to know. Um, for infiltrators and nightshades, your offhand weapon spec affects both your offhand damage and how often your offhand attacks. So how often you swing with that offhand weapon. For Shadow Blades, it's a little bit different, right? Your offhand will swing 100% of the time. That's not to say you'll hit 100% of the time, right? You can still miss, you can still be blocked or parried or evaded or any of that stuff. But you'll swing, you'll attack with your offhand 100% of the time. The other thing about left axe is that it doesn't only determine your offhand damage, it determines your main hand damage too when using left axe styles. This is a reason why a lot of Shadow Blades spec 50 left axe and put no points into critical strike. It's because this left axe line is so powerful. They sort of think, okay, well, I have access to these specific mechanics. I should take advantage of that versus putting my points into critical strike. So anyway, back to Nightshades and Infiltrators. It's a lot more straightforward than Shadow Blades. You're talking about your swing rate and you're talking about your offhand damage. So much more simple, much more straightforward. That's what you need to know. Um, I'm assuming that we'll probably put out a video in the future that goes a little bit more in depth about offhand weapon spec, but as usual, you are more than welcome to leave a comment or contact us on the postcount.net forums in order to ask any questions that you might have. There's a lot of knowledgeable people over there that'd be more than happy to help you out. So that's about it as far as the individual spec lines go. Now that we've sort of talked about that, hopefully you have a general knowledge of what each spec line has to offer. And you can weigh the benefits and drawbacks of each spec. Um, you can sort of see, oh, okay, I want to be this kind of assassin. I want to be that kind of assassin. Well, okay, here's where I should put my points. Here's what I should do. Here's which assassin I should choose. Here's which realm I should decide to play. Hopefully that's the case. Be sure to keep an eye out for more assassin videos where we go in a little more in depth in our later videos. We're going to be talking about specific mechanics. We're going to be talking about tips and tricks, target selection, poison swapping, all that fun stuff. So yeah, make sure you keep an eye out for those. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you've never tried Dark Age before, be sure to head over to darkageofcamelot.com, download the 14-day free trial. And for all you veterans out there who haven't played in a while, be sure to take advantage of the 7 free days for returning players. All right, once again, I'm Boxy Brown, and thanks for tuning in.